In the glorious year of 1989, communist tyranny finally died. The first free government of Poland was headed by the Catholic dissident activist Tadeusz Mazowiecki. Mazowiecki was a Kultura reader and wished to implement the foreign policy plans proposed for a post-communist Poland by Jerzy Giedroyc. The first difficult challenge he faced were the Germans. The Germans had just seen the collapse of the East German state, and then the Kohl government began questioning the validity of the German-Polish border. Yes, this is not a joke, this actually happened. Some Germans in the audience may be surprised by this, since it is largely forgotten. Kohl even allowed his finance minister, Theo Weigel, to openly claim the Polish-German border was illegal. Why did Kohl do all of this? Because it was an election year. He wanted desperately to win, so reunification would be seen as his legacy, and therefore he also wanted to appeal to German far-right fringe voters who called for taking historically German territory from Poland. Throughout that campaign, Poland was legitimately fearful that it would soon be faced with a Germany that may demand territory. Mazowiecki even threatened that if Germany did not agree to the border soon, he would continue a Polish-Soviet alliance. But then Helmut Kohl visited Gorbachev and got Soviet approval for unification and a Soviet military withdrawal in exchange for economic aid. Not only would the Soviet Union not rein in on Germany on behalf of Poland, as Mazowiecki had hoped, it also outmaneuvered Poland to scheme with Germany behind its back, which brought back some very dark memories. After Kohl won re-election, he demanded that the border would not be recognized until the Polish government gave legal guarantees for German minorities in Poland. Kohl then excluded the Poles from the 2+4 settlement negotiations, which enraged the Poles even more. In the end, it was the Americans who came in on behalf of the Poles, insisting that a unified Germany that was going to be a NATO member would only get American approval if Germany fully accepted and recognized its new borders with Poland. Now, this entirely unnecessary circus that the Helmut Kohl government staged had long-lasting consequences, because this was the first impression the German state made on the new Polish Republic. And in European foreign relations, first impressions can be very long-lasting. You can go talk to Polish international relations students. You can go talk to Poles involved in foreign policy, be it left, center, or right. They all remember this moment. To be clear, Poles do not believe that the Germans are about to invade and take land. That is not the impression that Kohl's selfish stupidity left. Instead, the impression it left for the Poles is that Germany is unreliable, that Germany is untrustworthy, that Germany will go over Poland to Russia in attempts to outmaneuver Poland and keep her out of the conversation, and that therefore Germany is not a good choice for an international partner. That is Kohl's legacy in German-Polish relations. Modern German-Polish relations are difficult because Germany has to overcome a Polish question mark over German trustworthiness. German-Polish relations improved later, in particular with the German push for Polish EU membership, but that question mark, to an extent, is still here right now. The fact that the Americans came in on behalf of the Poles to rein in on Helmut Kohl also reiterated to Poland the necessity and importance of good relations with the United States. Poland would from there on continue to put much diplomatic effort into deepening that relationship. Poland joined NATO in 1999, Poland joined the United States in their war in Iraq, and one of the main Polish foreign policy priorities was to get an American base in Poland, which was seen as the ultimate securer of Polish statehood and sovereignty. America stepping in to help the Poles in difficult negotiations with the Germans down the road made Poland America's most loyal and trustworthy ally in Europe. This American-Polish alliance is now, after 30 years, beginning to erode. This is an incredible recent development in European and American foreign relations. And even though this video series that you are watching right now is largely about Polish foreign policy throughout the last 30 years, this is a news item of such significance that I have to point it out in this video. While I was making these videos, I did not expect this to happen, and it puts significant challenges on Poland now and on Europe at large. For a few weeks now, this new American hostility toward Europe has dominated the news here. all over Europe. Conversations that were unthinkable just a few years ago are now happening across Europe. The dominant news item coming out of Europe these days is that Europe is rearming, as the Americans are increasingly pulling out their defensive commitments. All of this has, of course, not left the politics of European countries untouched. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, from the Polish Law and Justice Party, recently called on the Americans to station nuclear weapons in Poland, while the Polish prime minister, from the Civic Platform Party, has called on Poland to end its defensive dependency on the Americans and work with the European partners in making Europe independent in defense. On Ground News, you are able to see how different news outlets cover this story. Of the 170 sources, we can see that 50% of the coverage on this story is coming from the left, with only 25% coming from the right, making this a potential blind spot for the right. And it is noticeable that despite the differences in left and right, European media is almost unified in its support of European partners in defense, from the left-leaning Spiegel out of Germany to the conservative Le Figaro from France. This political division over whether or not to rely on the Americans or go independent in defense can be seen across Europe at large. The NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte, like Duda, believes in continuing the American alliance, just like the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, while Macron in France and Merz in Germany argue more along the lines of European defense autonomy. News items like these sometimes fly past the mainstream media 24/7 news cycle, where important and developing stories on European politics are often sidelined. This is why I use Ground News to stay informed on the news and for the stories that I research for my videos. In particular, the Ground News blind spot feed is a great feature to surface the stories that are often sidelined. You can use it for yourself by going to ground.news/Kraut. It will be important to keep track of this European defense debate to see which camp wins out in the end. Will we build European defense autonomy or bet on MAGA just being an American phase, with the American alliance eventually returning? With Ground News, you can keep track of the biases in the reporting on this issue to see which political camp supports which position in the defense debate. You will also be able to track how coverage differs by country, and Ground News is an excellent tool for not only keeping up to date with the news, but to see the nuances behind the reporting by various outlets that prevents you from getting lost in a media bubble. I have worked with Ground News for over 2 years now, and in this time they have become an important part of how I engage with news, so I encourage you to check them out. My viewers can save 40% off unlimited access by scanning the QR code on the screen or go to ground.news/Kraut. Thank you to Ground News for being a long-term friend of this channel. When it comes to her other neighbors, Poland had easygoings in the Czech Republic in building excellent relations. Because years before communism ended, Polish and Czech dissidents had met in the Sudeten Mountains in what were disguised as hiking and beer drinking trips. Don't ask me what a hiking and beer drinking trip is. I guess it's a Czech thing. During these meetings, they formed the Czechoslovak-Polish Solidarity Group, which smuggled and translated dissident material and built a framework for diplomatic relations between their countries for when communism would finally end. And when communism did finally die, these dissidents became the leaders of their countries. And these leaders had agreed beforehand that there were to be no border disputes and that there was to be reconciliation over past conflicts and disputes, as both countries began to work together closely. One of Václav Havel's first acts as Czech president was to found the Visegrad Group, which bound Poland, Czechia, Hungary, and eventually Slovakia together to cooperate in achieving common diplomatic and political goals, such as joining NATO and the European Union. The Visegrad Group ended up becoming arguably one of the greatest foreign policy success stories of post-communist Europe. And as most of you probably know already, Polish-Czech relations are some of the best in Europe. Poland had a far more difficult time in its foreign policy goals of building positive relations with Lithuania, but would eventually come forth mostly successful. Poland's successes in Lithuania are mainly the work of the Polish foreign minister from 1989 to 1993, Krzysztof Skubiszewski. Skubiszewski was a Solidarność activist, international relations expert, and a Kultura reader who also intended to implement Giedroyc's plan. He was in many ways the driving force of creating the frameworks of foreign policy of the Polish state after communism. His first challenge was to get Soviet troops out of Poland. The Soviets tried stopping this, but what came to bite the Soviets in the arse here is that in the Warsaw Pact Treaty there was officially no requirement for any country to have Soviet troops stationed in it. So in theory, a Warsaw Pact country could demand that Soviet troops get out. Of course, under communism, this theory didn't matter at all, but after communism died, theory became praxis. The Soviet Union had no choice but to get out, so in 1991, the alliance was dissolved. Consequently, there was zero legal justification left for Soviet soldiers to be in any foreign soil in Europe. It took the Soviet Union 2 years to pull all its troops out of Poland. By the time the last soldier left Poland on the 18th of September 1993, he was no longer a Soviet soldier, but a Russian soldier. The Polish president, Lech Walesa, in a final symbolic insult, saw off the Russian army leaving Poland the day before the 17th of September, the anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland as part of the Nazi-Communist alliance. As the Soviet Union began to disintegrate, Poland sought to establishing relations with the states that emerged, beginning with Lithuania. When Lithuania began drifting out of the Soviet Union, the Soviets sent in tanks to brutally crush those ambitions.
Mikhail Gorbachev ordered the implementation of a series of measures against Lithuania.
Government there defying Mikhail Gorbachev's order to surrender firearms.
On January 11th in 1991, Soviet forces rolled into Vilnius with tanks and troops, targeting key infrastructure like the TV tower, government buildings and communication centers. Their goal? To silence Lithuania's voice and crush its independence movement.
Psychological warfare above Lithuania. Soviet helicopters rained down demands for an end to independence.
The biggest display of Soviet military power in Lithuania since it proclaimed independence.
What they didn't expect was the sheer willpower of the Lithuanian people. Thousands gathered around the TV tower, unarmed and undeterred, creating a human shield and forming barricades to protect the Vilnius TV tower, the symbol of free press and communication. The Soviets, true to their form, responded with brute force. Tanks rolled over barricades, soldiers fired live rounds, and chaos erupted. Hey, this is Pekka from the channel Vatnik Soup. We have a video on our channel on Lithuanian independence that you can watch if you want to learn more. The link to the video is in the description.
The Polish government instantly condemned the Soviet Union, called a Security Council meeting of the OSCE in Europe, invited Lithuanian representatives to join the council with them, and the Polish public protested and collected aid to be sent to Lithuania. But the way the Soviet Union had conducted the invasion of Lithuania had already damaged Polish-Lithuanian relations somewhat. Let's explain why. In Lithuania, Vilnius used to be a mostly Polish city. Between the two world wars there were frequent clashes and eventually a war that resulted in Vilnius falling under Polish control. At the start of the Second World War, an addendum to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact gave Vilnius to Lithuania. Then the Soviets occupied Lithuania, then the Nazis occupied Lithuania, who began deporting the Lithuanian Poles to Nazi-occupied Poland. Then the Soviet Union occupied Lithuania again, and the remaining Polish Lithuanians were deported to Poland. But the communists decided to keep a small minority of Poles in Lithuania, in the villages and the countryside south of Vilnius. This Polish minority was then granted special privileges through Moscow. The Soviets basically instrumentalized this Polish minority of Lithuania, pitching them up against Lithuanians in a divide and conquer fashion. Basically the same thing the communists did in Central Asia, the Caucasus and the Balkans, pitting ethnic groups up against each other to ensure Russian overlords remained unquestioned. As Lithuania struggled for independence in 1991, the Soviets attempted to use this Polish minority of Lithuania to, in effect, create a pro-Russian Polish statelet, a sort of Polish version of Transnistria in the Baltic, called the Vilno-Polish National Territorial Authority, that with Soviet support would have declared independence, in effect creating a Russian-occupied zone of an unrecognized Polish communist Russian puppet statelet in the Baltic. But these Soviet schemes failed because the Polish state decided to side with the Lithuanians against the Russians and the pro-Russian Polish minority. They did so because, if you remember from a previous video, in accordance with the Giedroyc plan, the state is more important than the nation, and positive relations and alliance with Lithuania are a priority. So Lithuania became an independent state with full control over its territory. But the Soviets had accomplished one thing with their schemes. They sowed some seeds of mistrust in Lithuania over Poland and their Polish minority. As a result, throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, Poles and Lithuanians worked on rooting out that Russian-planted distrust of each other. The two countries established diplomatic relations which became close, but there were still signs of discomforts throughout the 1990s. These mostly had to do with history. The Lithuanians demanded that the Polish state officially apologize for the 1921 occupation of Vilnius, and the Polish state refused. From the Polish perspective, this issue cannot be discussed without also confronting the deportations of the Lithuanian Poles to Poland. Eventually, concerns over the Polish minority in Lithuania also arose in Polish politics. Language laws and administrative laws required public officials to speak Lithuanian and secondary schools to teach only in Lithuanian. Some of these Lithuanian laws seemed rather petty, like demanding Poles spell their name in Lithuanian, and Lithuania also refused to sign the European Charter for protecting the languages of minorities. But we should not let all these past difficulties distract from one essential fact. Polish-Lithuanian relations are very good, because Poland and Lithuania spent 30 years of hard work to improve them and build what became one of the closest alliances in Europe. Poland championed Lithuanian EU and NATO membership. Poland was among the first to recognize Lithuanian independence, and Poland has supported Lithuania when it found itself threatened by Russia. To illustrate how significant this Polish-Lithuanian accomplishment in foreign policy is, it helps to take a step back and compare it to something. Take a look at everywhere else where the Soviets pitted ethnic groups up against each other and created knots of conflict that persisted to the present day. Poland and Lithuania are the only ones who managed to untie their Soviet-inherited conflict knot. As you probably noticed throughout this video so far, the main issue that had to be overcome in Polish-Lithuanian relations were the legacies of historical conflicts. This would become even more of an issue in building Poland's relations with Ukraine. Much of modern Western Ukraine and southern Poland were shaped by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In that kingdom, the modern borders between modern Ukraine and modern Poland did not exist, and as a result, the populations became largely mixed Polish-Ukrainian, with both nationalities living in this region and many speaking both languages. This came to a brutal end between 1918 and 1949. Ukraine and Poland both re-emerged as independent states after the First World War. Poland claimed the lands that are today Western Ukraine, and in 1918 Poland and Ukraine went to war over these lands. Poland won. It annexed these lands and other Polish-populated lands they gained from Lithuania and Belarus. The ensuing chaos contributed to the collapse of Ukraine when the Soviets invaded a weakened Ukraine in 1919. These events caused huge resentments against Poles in Ukrainian populations. Ukrainian far-right nationalist and fascist groups began developing in the underground that targeted Poles. In 1939, a Nazi-Communist alliance invaded Poland, and as part of the agreement between the two, the Soviet Union annexed the lands Poland had gained as a result of the Polish-Ukrainian War. The Soviets began a Ukrainianization policy enforced upon the Poles it occupied, murdered the Polish intelligentsia, and deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to Siberia. Then the Nazis betrayed their communist allies and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. What happened next in this large stretch of land were some of the worst series of crimes of the 20th century. I have decided to summarize it in brief here, in what is admittedly a way that does not do these events justice, but I believe it is far more appropriate to someday make a separate video covering what happened here in the 30 years between 1919 and 1949. When the Nazis occupied Western Ukraine, a Ukrainian fascist group called the OUN emerged from the underground and began targeting the Poles who lived in these lands. The Nazis arrested some of them, but recruited others as collaborators to carry out the Holocaust Holocaust in this region, murdering one of the world's largest Jewish populations. Meanwhile, the OUN itself continued a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign targeting the Poles, while the Polish resistance fought both the Nazis and the OUN, but on occasion also carried out massacres of Ukrainians in revenge attacks for massacres of Poles by the OUN. When the Nazis began losing the war, many members of the OUN broke with them, went into the underground, and continued a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Poles that would last even beyond the Nazi occupation into 1949. When the Nazis were driven out of this region in 1944, the Soviets enforced the borders of the Yalta Agreement, and then the Soviets ordered that the surviving Poles of Western Ukraine be rounded up and deported to Poland, and the Polish communists, for their part, ordered that all Ukrainians in Poland be rounded up and deported to Ukraine. These deportations were brutal and caused tens of thousands of deaths. They were completed by 1949. So here are some facts you need to know. This region of the European map, which is today roughly divided between northwest Ukraine and southeast Poland, was for centuries a melting pot of different cultures and peoples: Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and one of the largest Jewish populations of the world, all lived here. The mixing of these peoples was mainly facilitated through two historical multi-ethnic empires, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Austrian Empire. And between 1919 and 1949, all of that ended, and it ended in genocide and ethnic cleansing. A Polish-Ukrainian war began a process of separation. The Nazis murdered the entire Jewish population, of which close to none survived the Holocaust, and under Nazi occupation, ethnic cleansing drove the Polish and Ukrainian populations further apart. And then from 1944 to 1949, final deportations and ethnic cleansings conducted by the communists separated the populations completely and created the modern borders between Ukraine and Poland. When Poland, 40 years later, after the end of communism, engaged in foreign policy with its eastern neighbors, old historic wounds that had not healed properly became a significant factor. We saw this before with Lithuania, but it would nowhere be more the case than with Ukraine, and we will cover how Poland and Ukraine met these challenges in the next video.